Supply Chain Summit 2020, all virtual, biggest in the world. Here's a new start to our podcast, but I wanted to let everybody know that we are organizing the biggest virtual event with 50 global speakers and a lot of great companies, great case studies and sharings on different relevant topics of supply chain, 16th, 17th of July. Do join us. Ping me on LinkedIn, find me and ping me, and I will get you a heavily discounted ticket as long as you do that before the 10th of July. See you there. Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Alpet Global. It's my pleasure to have with us today Maria Villablanca, who is the co-founder and CEO of Future Insights Network, a fast-growing membership of over 50,000 manufacturing, supply chain, and digital transformation executives. Future Insights Network is one of the largest networks of its kind, provides relevant content, connections, and collaboration for leaders in supply chain, manufacturing, and digital transformation, and has as key areas of focus Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, Industry 4.0, digital transformation, supply chain, and manufacturing strategy. Before starting the network, Maria worked for many years in the events and professional services businesses, working across continents with a strong passion for connecting people and ideas. So without further ado, great to have you, Maria, and thanks for making the time to join us.
Radu, thank you so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure. So let's start first and foremost with your story. How did you make a career ultimately in building professional communities, and why did you decide to create Future Insights Network?
Well, I don't think the podcast is long enough for me to tell you my story because that would take a long time, but let me give you the short version. How about that? Basically, as you explained there in a little brief of my bio, I have been in the event space or had been in the event space for a very long time. And I noticed that the one-to-one events, conferences, exhibitions space was becoming very similar, very hard to distinguish one from another. They were being churned out on a regular basis. And I was going to so many of them that I couldn't even tell you which one I was at. So as a result of that, I realized that the really valuable insight that was coming from these conferences and events was happening almost in the moments in between the conferences. So the coffee breaks, or when someone was sitting next to someone else at a bus on the way to a site visit, you know what I mean? The magic really was happening with the connections. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really good conferences out there and a lot of really good events out there, but generally speaking, I felt that the value was in the connections. And so after a career in that space, I decided to look at focusing on that connection side of the business and creating a network of people that were like-minded, that wanted to drive towards the same sort of goal, which is to cut through hype and noise around digital transformation. And that's kind of why we exist, really.
Mm-hmm. And obviously you deal with lots and lots of supply chain executives, and that's basically the bulk of your community. With COVID, I guess supply chain has probably never been as prominent or important, because all of a sudden with this crisis, companies realize that, holy cow, if we don't have proper supply chain in place, if we don't have the proper tools, visibility, technology, and so on, we can't get our product in the hands of our consumers anymore. We don't know where it is in the logistics process. We don't know where it is in our network, and so on. So what would you say, from talking and knowing so many of these executives, what would keep them up at night in this current situation and times?
Well, you know what? I'm going to take it further prior to COVID, really, because before COVID, there was a lot of disruption and a lot of conversation around digital transformation. And that was propelled by a number of different factors, including the different types of pace of change, really. The pace of change is so significant in comparison to other moments in time. Equally, on top of that, consumer behavior has changed. Amazon has really changed the game with the way that consumers engage with businesses and what expectations they have for getting their goods. That plus customization, personalization, there's so many different factors that was changing supply chain anyway pre-COVID. Here comes COVID now, and the conversation around digital transformation becomes even more important. So I think in terms of what keeps them up at night, it's whether or not they're able to implement digital transformation in their businesses whilst managing crisis. And I like to say that it's kind of like changing the tires on your car whilst it's moving on the highway and maybe even on fire. That's kind of what these people are up against. And I think right now, to stay competitive and to stay ahead of the curve, it's imperative to implement these kinds of technologies that allows them to, for example, predict demand and deal with that kind of demand from their consumers.
Hmm. Wanted to ask, to make it more concrete for our audience, if you can think of some examples of companies, case studies, without necessarily naming them, but just, maybe the industry and some, some broad specifics of what did they do right, some lessons that you have seen or some principles that you've seen them apply that could be useful also for the supply chain executives listening to us.
Well, it's very difficult for me to pinpoint one or two companies perhaps that are doing an excellent job. There are a number of lists out there for supply chains that are doing a great job, and I think everyone's very aware of them. What I can tell you is that in the many conversations I've had with our supply chain members, they all seem to have one thing in common, and that is that instead of implementing digital transformation for the sake of digitization, for the sake of advancing their digital agenda, they've done so to solve one problem or a number of problems. They've done so to solve certain pain points in their business. And they've also done so to understand what their customer is looking for. So to me, I would say the companies that are really doing this very well are companies that have at the heart of everything they do the customer and understanding what the customer wants. And that's helped them stay competitive. And B, those organizations that implement digital transformation to solve problems within their business instead of just, wow, let's just get this amazing robotic arm,
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's actually a common hype type of a challenge. Whilst I guess now with COVID, it has really forced companies to be very specific and very clear issues, and probably has accelerated like no other time in human history, like you rightfully said. And this type of fastening of this deployment, if you want. And I guess also some of the, I don't know if you've also seen, because without naming again, and I'm jumping a little bit on a topic that just popped into my mind, you have on the one side, you have these software providers that are, let's say, more established, where you used to have 2 to 5 years implementations of their supply chain solutions, supply chain software, whatever it may be, ERP. And now you have a bunch of new players coming, and they've been actually around the market for a while, which can basically digitalize your factory, create a digital twin, create a model, give you visibility in your network as long as you have the data, basically duplicate your data in 4 to 8 weeks. And that's what it takes. It's just that basically before COVID, people maybe they had the reluctance in their own minds on this is, almost like this is a sham, this is a scam. How can it be so fast?
It's too good to be true. Too good.
It's
Yeah,
too good to be true. Exactly. And now, basically, that's where I wanted to ask you: are you seeing also in this particular, very specific, adopting new software, new technologies? Do you see a much more faster willingness to adopt, or how? What's your perspective on this?
I think I ran my first supply chain event probably 20 years ago, and there were only a handful of players really in the software space, like you say, and not only that, but the implementation time, the evaluation time for evaluating, implementing, carrying out a project like a full ERP implementation could take 5-6 years or more, right? Technology is moving at such a pace right now, and again, driven by advances in technology, driven by the consumer behavior that's demanding certain things in a certain way. There are companies that are sprouting up that are very disruptive, that are using AI and machine learning technology to really advance their implementation time so quickly, which is great. But at the same time, I think it scares a lot of people. It really does. Even pre-COVID, think, is this too good to be true? So I think there's a bit of two things happening. There are those companies that are still thinking in that old methodology or that old way of, I still need to evaluate this from a large scale perspective. Implementing machine learning is going to be something huge. And there are those companies that realize that actually, if we prototype this, if we start small and maybe look at just one segment of our demand planning, or maybe we look at one segment of one element of the supply chain to gain end-to-end visibility, we may be able to do things a lot quicker. So I'm seeing two types, really. I'm seeing those people that are taking a long time to make these decisions, and I'm seeing those companies that are trying things in a small way. Now, during COVID, right now, there are still a lot of people that realize that if they don't change their supply chains, or adapt, they're not going to be relevant in this modern age. And so I think it's about those companies that really want to stay competitive are going to actually implement things in a faster way. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. And it brings to my mind a discussion that I was part of. I guess it's more than 6 months now because it was in a live conference. I don't know, probably 12 months ago. It was a face-to-face event, and one of the speakers, which was a major FMCG, one of the top global FMCG companies, they were saying that their modus operandi, which was impressive given the fact that they have 100,000 plus employees, right? Their modus operandi was basically to try new things at a very small scale. You know, you start with one factory, two factories, you test it out, you learn from the mistakes. You know, I mean, obviously there's always going to be mistakes, but you do it at a small scale, low risks. And if you're going to, you know, make a mistake, disrupt your factory, you can always, you know, fall back on another factory in the network. You're not going to, you know, destroy your whole operations, so, or endanger your whole operations. So that was there basically, that was the way they were implementing things. And I found that to be extremely, I don't know if entrepreneurial is the right word, but it's a very good low, you know, mitigating your risk whilst at the same time maintaining that appetite for trying new things. And once that was successful, 1-2 factories, then you can roll it out to maybe 4 at a time, 8 at a time, and then eventually you reach the whole network. But you don't do it in the whole, you know, one go, because if if something goes wrong, all of a sudden your whole supply chain ecosystem is down. So I like that as a way of thinking.
Well, it's the moonshot approach versus the prototype approach. You know, you can decide to do a moonshot. We're going to the moon in X amount of time, and that's what we're doing. And I think companies that were taking those moonshot approaches, like, you know, we're going to solve cancer by this date, take a long time. It's a huge investment. It's a huge investment of time, people, effort, etc., to completely change your business. You know, to completely transform your business. I think those companies that do it with a small prototype, like you say, they mitigate their risk. They are able to implement different types of entrepreneurial, agile thinking, and so they're able to perhaps move quicker.
And reminder, our virtual supply chain summit, 16th and 17th of July. We have 6,000 people that have registered from 109 countries, with people speaking at C-level, executives from FMCG, aerospace, technology, electronics, and healthcare and pharmaceutical companies. All relevant topics. Do come and join us. And to get a heavily discounted tickets specifically for our podcast listeners, ping me on LinkedIn before the 10th of July and we'll get you one. And how do you see, another thing that pops into my mind, how do you see the symbiosis at some point, I guess, but it's, it's really the partnerships between big multinationals and startups, right? It's that kind of scale that the multinational has obviously brings a huge distribution of your solution if successful. And at the same time, the startup brings obviously the agility, creativity, innovation that an MNC may or may not have anymore. Mostly they wouldn't.
Yeah. It's a trend I've been seeing for the last couple of years, which is companies wanting to adopt the kind of agile entrepreneurial spirit that you can get in a small startup. And at the same time, we've connected a number of startups with large-scale businesses because they are able to teach infrastructure and different types of thinking to the agile startup owner, for example, the young, thriving millennial sort of startup owner. But I have seen a number of companies, be it large-scale automotives to FMCG companies to even pharma companies, trying to create an entrepreneurial spirit in a small way within their businesses. So you get a lot of prototyping there too. And thinking very agile is something that I was surprised to see with such large-scale bureaucracy. Let me just say large-scale businesses that maybe have a reputation for being multi-layered and bureaucratic, they're trying to adopt more agile thinking. Yeah, it's definitely something that's happening.
I want to put out this example that kind of came to my memories, sprung to memory, was on a country level. This happened at the country level. Again, a really large company, really large recognizable brand. So let's not name them for the sake of the discussion and how we started it, but multi-billion-dollar FMCG again. And what they did, and I had never heard to this point of such a behavior, which just impressed me a lot. They took the management team of the country, which was, I don't know, a business of 1 to 2 billion in that particular geography. And they put them for 2 weeks in a startup. So basically the CEO worked, didn't become the CEO of the startup, but worked in the startup, hand in hand with the, on top of, it wasn't a full time, but it was, 4-hour a day kind of a thing, where he would just go in there and almost be treated like an intern in that startup to observe how they did things, processes, and so on. And that happened with his whole management team. 6, 7, whatever people were in that business, $2 billion, one to 2 billion. And then the startup folks, the CEO and the management team of the startup, went inside the MNC, and it was almost like if you want a experience exchange program. And they, it impressed me a lot because, okay, from the startup, I can see that they can learn a lot. But from the other side, the MNC to look after the way they could learn from a startup, that I hadn't quite known this as a way to do things before. So that was quite a way to cross-pollinate.
Yeah, I've seen that before. I saw that with a large scale automotive business here in Europe that did that had sort of a cross-pollination between, or merging to some degree, of management styles with a startup company. There's a lot to be learned. There is a lot to be learned to having that kind of agile, quick thinking, to solving crises, and at the same time failing quickly. That's an example. That's something that startups do really well. And that is that startups are able to fail quickly and go from there. Whereas a big company, it's a lot harder to fail. And it's a lot more catastrophic to some degree to fail in large businesses. So adopting that kind of mentality has been successful for a lot of businesses. And I think now with COVID, I like to say that once we hit COVID, there were a number of phases that supply chain leaders went through. The first one was the phase of panic. I mean, everybody had that, but the phase of panic then came the phase of, okay, hold on a second, we kind of know what we're doing here. Let's continue to adopt, the things that we've always done well. And the third phase, I think the kind of phase that we're in right now, is what are the opportunities that we can get, that we can create out of COVID? And those involve things like creating new business models. And that means potentially working like startups in some ways, creating new, more environmentally friendly, sustainable business models, looking at the future of work, looking at our leadership structures. So I think right now the phase that we're in is quite an interesting one, where companies are trying to look at what was the lessons that were learned, but equally, what are the opportunities that lie ahead?
Mm-hmm. I know that one of our clients was sharing that there's a couple of big topics that for sure will change for them. So I was talking to the CEO of a region, and he was saying that one, he's gonna minimize the space in the office by 50%. He's gonna cut the office space by 50%, and flexible work arrangements in his mind now are just a given. He will implement it. He's now convinced that it works by hook or by crook, and then basically he's gonna cut the space by 50% and just make everybody with flexible work arrangements. So that was number one. And also number two, another very clear observation or kind of realization from this situation is that we do not need so much business travel. That a lot of times, we just got into a mode of, okay, let's just go and meet face to face, but you don't need it. And you also don't need a lot of the meetings that were wasting our time. And that's also another thing. You don't necessarily need to travel. I mean, it can be in the same office, but a lot of times you don't need so much meetings, right? So I guess that's another thing that on his mind, business travel, and also reducing a little bit and becoming more efficient in the way we make decisions was another big thing that would change. Do you see any other, I mean, this doesn't necessarily have to apply to supply chain, but do you see any other such trends that will occur in the workplace after COVID?
I think more collaboration, is something that's going to be very valuable. Collaboration, both internally, externally as well, collaborating with other businesses. I also think that the supply chain, like you said at the beginning when you were doing the introduction, has never been more front of mind with everybody. You turn on the news and you hear about supply chain. I mean, I've got people talking to me about supply chain that I didn't even knew what that was. If I explained what supply chain was to anybody, what I did for a living, most people just didn't understand. Whereas now supply chain is topical. And so I think one of the things that's going to emerge is the strength of the supply chain leader as a fundamental person in the strategic development or strategic leadership teams of a business. They've been more popular and more involved in recent years, but I think COVID, if anything, what it's done, it's elevated even more so the strategic importance of the supply chain leader.
It's a great point that you make. I mean, I think And obviously we activate a lot in the executive search business through one of our business units. And I guess there's been a long-standing desire for supply chain to be, and wish for supply chain to have a seat at the board, to have a seat on the C-suite, true seat on the C-suite. And whilst we have seen pockets, right, and you've seen, the gentleman at Apple used to come from, he was a chief operations officer. Miss Barra from General Motors, I think she was also in supply chain and operations before she became CEO. So there are pockets of examples, but look, I mean, in the overall scheme, I like to be optimistic and positive. I mean, if I am to look at the numbers, it's not that. I mean, still is a career path usually to become a CEO. But I think after this crisis, more, and I'm kind of echoing your on that front. And now I also want to kind of ask you on the same perspective, what do you think that supply chain leaders need or lack to get to the CEOs more? I mean, there are certain characteristics. I'll give you an example, right? For me, I think there is sometimes the attitude or mindset that I see a lot. Supply chain professionals and executives tend to be people that get stuff done. That strong mentality. I will get it done. I will get it made. I will get it delivered. You can count on me. However, in the bigger scheme of things of a multi-billion-dollar MNC, that skill is not sometimes as important as the skill of influencing skills, change management, leadership at the broadest picture, relationship with stakeholders internally and externally. So those, right? So I'm just curious from your perspective, are things that you consider supply chain executives should focus more, develop more to have a better chance of getting to the CEO position?
I would disagree to some degree, and I think that the supply chain leaders today have that skill in abundance. I think previously they were functioning within a silo, and supply chain was back office, the people that got things done, right? The people that moved goods and got things done. I think with e-commerce and with the way that consumers are changing things, you're seeing supply chain have a great big influence in sales and marketing and finance. So they're really reaching across the aisles, and that's why collaboration is going to be a big thing, or continue to be a big thing moving forward post-COVID. So I would say that prior to maybe a few years ago, I would have said that they're not necessarily that influential. However, now I think they're getting even more influence. Whether or not they take advantage of it is a different story. And I would agree with you that it is definitely a skill that is needed. I think the problem for me is that supply chain previously has been seen as such a back office role. I think supply chain has an image issue, or had an image issue prior to COVID. You didn't tell your kids at school, counselors didn't say at school, oh, you should totally go into supply chain, even though supply chain is probably where some of the biggest innovation is happening today. So I think the image issue that we had prior to COVID is probably going to be rectified because of COVID, where people are going to recognize the value that supply chain brings to the table in adding value to the business and adding value to the bottom line. It's not just a cost center, right? So if I go back 10 years ago, that's what supply chain was, a cost center. Whereas now supply chain has a really good opportunity to become an influencer in the bottom line of a business. And so in terms of the leadership skills that the supply chain leader needs to take is perhaps maybe owning that a lot better PR for themselves at how much influence they have in that space. That's kind of what I would say.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, better PR for themselves.
Yeah,
Fully
again,
agree.
and again, working on that image issue. I think getting more talent into the space that thinks in a diverse manner, that brings people from different diverse backgrounds to sort of challenge the norm of thinking, that is going to help propel, along with digital transformation and getting very digitally savvy or having a digital mindset, is going to make the supply chain leader fundamentally important. It's strategically important within any given business.
And in terms of this point, talent and also attracting the right skills, because when it comes to innovation in supply chain, especially on most of the areas of topic, actually, an interest that you're talking a lot during your events in your network, right? You have IoT, artificial intelligence, Industry 4.0 with all the different aspects. Where do you see that there's the biggest or some of the biggest needs for the industry to do more? Is it for supply chain executives to attract more talent? Is it like data scientists? Is it like fighting with Google and Facebook to get some of that talent? What kind of talent and skills do you see being needed the most?
It's funny. I asked that similar question a lot to the people that I interview and the people I speak with in our membership side. But the answer that keeps coming back is having digital savviness and skill is great, and it's fundamental for the future, right? I mean, no one's going to be able to get on without having that kind of digital insight, right? But without having the business understanding of what a supply chain does and the influence supply chain can have to the bottom line, you really can't get further without that. I mean, having digital technology as a skill is great, but without the business understanding and the way that supply chain is fundamentally linked to the bottom line, it's not you don't have the full package. So I think having both is fundamental. To me, the biggest issue with attracting talent is not with the supply chain function per se, it's with the image issue that the supply chain function has. And I think that insofar as supply chain, we have a long way to go to try to improve the image. There's so much change and so much innovation happening right now. To be able to predict demand using using AI and machine learning, that's really sexy, really interesting stuff. The kind of things that we're talking about with digital twins, robotics, 3D printing, the level of innovation that's happening here. I would say that supply chain functions perhaps are more sexy and more attractive than working at a startup. Yet, unfortunately, for a young grad, working at a startup is more fundamental. So I think, or more attractive, right? So I think that there's ways to go with supply chain leaders being able to articulate the value that they bring to a business in order to attract top talent. Does that make sense?
It does. It does a lot. And that loops back into the PR and making sure
Yeah.
a lot more. I mean, how I tend to frame it and share with the executives that we speak to and so on, and encourage them, and also use LinkedIn to do that. Storytell. They need to storytell more. They need to explain to people why do they do what they do, because most of them actually are highly passionate individuals. What I have come to appreciate, they love what they do and they find a huge meaning. And actually, people like us that have been around, okay, I never took a study, I never did a diploma in supply chain, right? I'm not I'm myself, I don't know about, I haven't checked your background, but I don't come from supply chain per se. I've grown into it, and I've grown passionate about it the more I learned about it. Most of these professionals in supply chain, they actually love what they do. And, I mean, it's very simple things, like we would literally, as human beings, would not be able to have access to most things if there wasn't, I mean, every physical product, literally, if there was no supply chain. The supply chain is ultimately the backbone of everything we consume. However, is a very poorly or not at all said. So that's the thing. If we get that story more, I spoke to one of my friends who's a CEO for a shipping line, and he told me, like, when I asked him, why do you do what we do? And he was saying, because we enable global trade, Radu, because we help you get the bananas that you want from Ecuador, right? Or from Philippines, because without you wouldn't eat avocado. Yeah, that I can understand.
It goes beyond that. Without supply chains, sick people don't get medicine. Without supply chains, it's not just about global trade. It's life and death in many instances. It's food. It's everything, as well as the things like getting my iPhone on time, or getting my package delivered from a store. It touches everything. So I think really, in terms of attracting talent, it's not about management issues. It's not so much about management issues. Let me correct myself. There is, of course, lots to do to bridge the talent gap in terms of making sure you create the right environment and atmosphere for young, enthusiastic talent to thrive. But on top of that, I think it's the image issue. It's being able to articulate the place that supply chain has in the world.
Yes. Final question from you, Arya. What would be the key piece of advice or sharing that you would give to a younger professional starting out that wants to have a long-standing career in supply chain?
Well, I think it's different now than it was 20 years ago, as I said, when I was just starting and running events and operating within supply chain. I think right now it would be talk to as many people from different areas as possible. One of the things that makes our network very successful is the fact that people are able and willing to collaborate with each other. You didn't see that many years ago. You would never have seen several, companies operating in the same space collaborating, whereas now they do. So I think, to me, yes, the younger generation of supply chain executives and leaders have a great deal of educational background that they bring to the table, and that's fantastic. They've got a great, diverse thinking that they bring to the table. That's fantastic as well. I would give advice in that: talk to people from your industry, outside of your industry, multiple industries, collaborate with them. And that's probably the best way to move supply chain forward, I think.
Could not agree more. And probably on the same note, try as many things on top of talking to
Yes.
people. And I'm sure that it's probably included in your statement is also try to get your hands dirty into many different types of projects and so on.
Very
No,
much.
awesome. Well, much appreciate your time, Maria. And I want to urge our listeners to have a look at Maria's network, the Future Insights Network website. I think you are open, right, for applications, right? So you need to
Absolutely.
apply if you're a professional and practitioner in supply chain. So it's pretty focused on adding the most value to practitioners in the field. And I would want you to have a look there and check out also their many events and many different content that they put out. And you also have a podcast. And great to have had you, and thanks a lot for the sharing.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I always love to have a conversation about supply chain.
Super. Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.